Hello all. Today we'll be moving from one illustrious Welsh poet called Thomas, last name Thomas, to another, last name Thomas. From R.S. Thomas to the, in fact, more celebrated Dylan Thomas. I found on the internet, to my alarm, that Dylan Thomas's stock as a poet, or at any rate as a figure that people have heard of who wrote poetry, has fallen so precipitously that out of every 1,000 people who had heard of Dylan Thomas, less than 10 years ago, there's only one left. I'm not sure who that poor individual is, but this represents a shocking development. It happens in literature, it happens in all fields of endeavor, but it's a surprise to somebody of my generation for whom Dylan Thomas, the poet, was a figure who was so emblematic of poetry in the mid-20th century that to imagine a world, a culture which did not lean heavily on his existence is still very difficult for me. After the Second World War, in the aftermath of the Second War, Dylan Thomas, a Welshman who had come up from Wales to London, where the poetry scene was thriving, was a bohemian figure, to put it mildly, who embodied the timeless, the ancient tradition of the Bacchic, the Dionysian reveler, the leader of the dance, the drinker of drink, the singer of songs, and the seducer of women. And although he was not, I would say, perhaps unfairly, an especially prepossessing or beautiful individual, he had a force of character and of course he had poetry sufficient to overcome any shortcomings he may have had in his looks. And maybe that's all in my mind, that he had any shortcomings at all. He certainly always claimed that he and his wife, Caitlin, were in bed together 10 minutes after they met. They met in a pub, so I'm not quite sure how they managed that. If indeed they did, it sounds like a poetic boast. She was then the mistress of another famous bohemian figure, the painter Augustus John. But he was not short of female company in his time. And so I dare say, to have your mistress stolen from you by the most spectacular, the most famous, the most glamorous poet of the age was not the most embarrassing thing to happen. So Dylan Thomas's stock has fallen in terms of people who have heard of him or perhaps read his poetry, something that was quite hard to get away from when I was a young man. He was already dead in 1953 when I was 9 years old. So when I was coming to maturity, when I was at boarding school and at college, he was another of those great figures, the recently dead young poet, the poet recently dead young, and still cast a spell. I had a wonderful friend at boarding school, a gifted poet, a Welshman who was also a very gifted rugby player, which is no less a tradition in the Welsh valleys. And he adored Thomas's poetry and imitated it, but in a truly as a tribute, in a beautiful, not merely mimicking it. He understood the driving force in Thomas's poetry and reproduced it in beautiful ways. So that was the Dylan Thomas that I grew up in the shadow of. And then a strange thing happened, which was that Dylan's name, which incidentally is pronounced Dullen, if you pronounce it correctly, that Y is actually what we would treat as a U, and the U on the end of the word is what we would treat as a Y. My own name, Carey, is written C-A-R-U, which means dweller in the care, in the castle, or more likely, person from the town that has a castle in it. There have been many aristocratic Careys, but I don't have any reason to think that I'm descended from one of them. So that transposition of the I and the U has not really been understood in British English by the British, and so and Dylan himself took on Dylan rather than Dullen. His mother already, I think, was afraid that it would imply that he was dull, and he'd be better off as Dylan. And then the strange thing that happened was that a young singer-songwriter in the North Country of America adopted Dylan as his name, and became enormously much more famous than Dylan Thomas. Became a world figure. Dylan Thomas was known throughout the English-speaking world, but Bob Dylan, Bob Zimmerman, he was born, but Bobby Dylan became a phenomenon that dwarfs the Dylan Thomas story, and he took the name in tribute to Dylan Thomas the poet. It's a name that means son of the sea, a figure in Welsh mythology, as I'm sure a few people know who call their child Dylan after Bob Dylan, as it's one of the most popular boys' names in America. It's a nice name, and it's spread far and wide and continues to grow at the same time as Dylan Thomas. The reason for Bobby Zimmerman's adoption of his name that's become so widespread becomes less well known. So as time went on, Dylan Thomas was afflicted by all kinds of illnesses. He was not the strongest constitution in the first place, but his drinking brought him down, and he stood one day at a pub in New York. You can go and stand there yourself if you're sufficiently interested, to stand in the footsteps of a man who is killing himself, and drank a series of whiskies which he afterwards, there wasn't much of an afterwards, but before dying, which happened almost immediately, he claimed that he had broken the world record for consecutive whiskey glasses, and maybe it was, probably not, but in any case it was enough to bring him low, and he never recovered. He never regained consciousness when he passed out from that epic drunk. And so he died young, as great poets were once supposed to do. That was supposed to be their trajectory, and it did no harm for a time to his reputation. So I thought I would read one of his poems to be able to convey something of his poetry. It's strong and lilting and echolalic and beautiful poetry. For my personal taste, I think his poetry is less formidable than his prose work, and less formidable than his extraordinary play, Under Milk Wood, written for radio, the greatest work ever written for that lovely form, radio drama, a form into which I poured many of my years. And I admire Under Milkwood as I admire no other radio play. So time sometimes sorts out these disparities, as at their death, Hemingway, for instance, was regarded as a great novelist but a negligible short story writer, and I think time has correctly reversed that judgment. And Scott Fitzgerald, the opposite way around. He was regarded as a significant short story writer and a negligible novelist, and I think we've discovered that that was incorrect. And maybe we will, with Dylan Thomas, reassess the value of his work. Or maybe I am simply quite wrong about his poetry, some of which I find achieves effects which are far too easy. I'm going to read Fern Hill, which is one of the great poems that he did not write as a teenager. Amazingly, some of the most formidable of his poems were written then. Fern Hill was written when he was 30 or so, and it's a beautiful, nostalgic poem about childhood. His poems are scarcely political. They're poems of defiance against time, and they're poems of love and regret and all those wonderful, important, universal things. And Fern Hill, this wonderful poem of his, begins, "Now as I was young and easy under the apple boughs, about the lilting house, and happy as the grass was green, the night above the dingle starry, time let me hail and climb, golden in the heydays of his eyes. And honoured among wagons, I was prince of the apple towns, and once below a time," that's the kind of effect that I disparage in Dylan's, "once below a time." Yes, but it's so facile. "And once below a time, I lordly had the trees and leaves trail with daisies and barley down the rivers of the windfall light. And as I was green and carefree, famous among the barns, about the happy yard, and singing as the farm was home, in the sun that is young once only, time let me play and be golden in the mercy of his means. And green and golden I was huntsman and herdsman. The calves sang to my horn, the foxes on the hills barked clear and cold, and the Sabbath rang slowly in the pebbles of the holy streams. All the sun long it was running, it was lovely, the hay fields high as the house, the tunes from the chimneys, it was air and playing, lovely and watery, and fire green as grass, and nightly under the simple stars as I rode to sleep, the owls were bearing the farm away. All the moon long I heard, blessed among stables, the nightjars flying with the ricks, and the horses flashing into the dark. And then to awake, and the farm, like a wanderer white with the dew, come back, the cock on his shoulder. It was all shining, it was Adam and maiden. The sky gathered again, and the sun grew round that very day. So it must have been after the birth of the simple light in the first spinning place, the spellbound horses waking warm out of the whinnying green stable onto the fields of praise. And honoured among foxes and pheasants, by the gay house under the new-made clouds, and happy as the heart was long, in the sun born over and over, I ran my heedless ways. My wishes raced through the house high, hey, and nothing I cared at my sky-blue trays. The time allows in all his tuneful turning, so few and such morning songs, before the children green and golden follow him out of grace. Nothing I cared in the lamb-white days, that time would take me up to the swallow-thronged loft, by the shadow of my hand in the moon that is always rising, nor that riding to sleep I should hear him fly with the high fields, and wake to the farm forever fled from the childless land. Oh, as I was young and easy in the mercy of his means, time held me green and dying, though I sang in my chains like the sea. Wonderful, triumphant last lines, the trumpet of Dylan Thomas's verse at its most magnificent. is an absolutely formidable thing, a thing to bow down to, a thing in which he carries on the great mantic tradition of the inspired poet. Thing of great beauty. Nothing very contentious in his poetry, not at all political, not at all divisive, but full of worship and joy and loss and defiance of time. A great poet, undoubtedly, and I hope you are able to come to love his verse as my friend Barney Powell did when we were teenagers together. Thank you.